In the Middle Ages, people did not believe God was watching them sometimes. They believed He was watching them always, not in moments of prayer, not only in church, not only during sin, but every second of every day. From the moment they woke to the moment they fell asleep, God was present. This belief shaped how people lived, how they thought, how they feared, and how they understood themselves. To understand why medieval people believed God was always watching, you must first understand the world they lived in. It was a world full of uncertainty. Harvests failed without warning. Illness struck without explanation. Children died suddenly. Storms destroyed homes. Fire consumed entire villages. There were no scientific explanations for most events, no concept of germs, no understanding of weather systems, no medical certainty. When something happened, people needed meaning. God provided that meaning. If crops grew, it was God's blessing. If they failed, it was God's punishment or a test. If someone recovered from illness, it was divine mercy. If they died, it was divine will. Nothing was random. Randomness was terrifying. A watching God made the chaos understandable. God was not distant. He was personal. Medieval Christianity taught that God saw everything, every action, every word, every thought. Even thoughts were dangerous. Sin was not just what you did. It was what you desired, what you imagined, what you secretly wanted. A person could appear righteous on the outside and still be condemned inside. This idea created constant self-surveillance. People watched themselves because they believed God already was. There was no private space. Homes were small and crowded. Bodies were exposed. Daily life happened in front of others. But even when alone, people were never truly alone. God was there, watching, judging, recording. Heaven and hell were not abstract concepts. They were real places, described in sermons, painted on church walls, carved into stone. Hell was not symbolic. It was fire, pain, endless suffering. And God decided who went there. Death was not the greatest fear. Judgment was. To die suddenly without confession was terrifying. It meant standing before God unprepared. This fear shaped behavior. People confessed regularly, not out of peace, but anxiety. They feared forgetting a sin. They feared dying at the wrong moment. They feared God seeing something they had not yet confessed. Even small sins mattered: lying, laziness, envy, impure thoughts. Nothing escaped God's gaze. Children were taught this early. God sees you when you lie. God hears you when you curse. God knows what you think. Fear became a tool of discipline. Parents used it. Priests reinforced it. Communities accepted it. God's watchfulness explained suffering. If someone was poor, it was God's plan. If someone was rich, it was God's favor, or a test. If someone suffered, it had meaning. Meaning was more important than fairness. This belief also offered comfort. God watched suffering too. He saw pain. He saw injustice. He saw endurance. People believed their suffering was witnessed, not ignored. This made hardship bearable. If God was watching, then suffering mattered. Nothing was wasted. Nothing was meaningless. This belief created obedience. People followed rules not because of law, but fear of divine observation. Breaking rules was dangerous, even if unseen by humans. God saw everything. This made authority powerful. Kings ruled by divine right. Priests spoke with divine authority. Disobedience was not just rebellion, it was sin. God watching also meant God testing. Life itself was a test. Patience, humility, obedience. People believed God was constantly evaluating them. A good life was preparation for judgment. This belief invaded inner life. Guilt was constant. People questioned their thoughts. their desires, their intentions. Am I sinful for wanting more food? Am I sinful for resenting my Lord? Am I sinful for being angry? God knew the answers. Even when people tried to hide from themselves, they could not hide from God. Dreams were seen as messages. Nightmares were warnings. Sudden fear was interpreted as divine reminder. Everything became symbolic. Nothing was neutral. This belief shaped time. Church bells divided the day. Prayer structured hours. Life revolved around God's presence. Even those who doubted rarely said it aloud. Doubt itself was sinful. To question God was to risk eternal punishment. Most people did not seek freedom from this belief. It was all they knew. A world without a watching God would be terrifying, without meaning, without justice, without hope. God watching meant someone cared, even if that care was strict, even if it was terrifying. For medieval people, being watched by God was not optional. It was reality. It explained life. It explained death. It explained suffering. And it shaped every thought, every fear, every action. They lived under the gaze of heaven, and they believed that gaze never blinked. This constant belief in being watched did not disappear when people were alone or when no authority was present. In many ways, it became strongest in those moments, when a person knelt beside their bed in the dark, when they walked a forest path with no one nearby, when they lay awake at night, listening to the wind outside their walls. The awareness of God felt even heavier. Silence did not bring relief. Silence meant nothing stood between the individual and God's gaze. People learned to interpret their own conscience as the voice of God watching from within. Guilt was not just an emotion, it was proof. Proof that God had seen something wrong. Proof that correction was needed. A clear conscience was rare. Most carried a constant sense of moral unease, unsure if they had done enough, prayed enough, repented enough. This internalization of divine surveillance meant that control no longer required force. People disciplined themselves. They punished their own thoughts. They restricted their own desires. Even when rules were unclear, fear filled the gaps. It was safer to deny oneself than to risk sin. It was safer to suffer quietly than to complain and be seen as ungrateful before God. The belief that God was always watching also shaped how people interpreted misfortune. When something went wrong, the first question wasn't what caused it, but why. What sin had invited this? What warning was being delivered? A broken leg, a dead child, a failed crop. These were not accidents. They were messages. God was speaking through events, and people feared misunderstanding him. Because God watched everyone, comparison became constant. People looked at others and tried to read God's judgment through their lives. Prosperity was suspicious. Suffering was ambiguous. A wealthy man might be favored or tested. A poor man might be punished or chosen to endure. No one could ever be certain, and that uncertainty deepened fear rather than relieving it. Public shame reinforced divine observation. When someone was punished, humiliated, expelled from the community, was seen as an echo of God's judgment on earth. Social order mirrored heavenly order. To be seen failing by others was terrifying, because it suggested God had already seen it first. Even joy was monitored. Excessive laughter, pleasure, celebration. All carried suspicion. Happiness without visible gratitude could be sinful. Enjoyment needed justification. Everything needed justification. God's watchfulness meant that even harmless moments were weighed. As death approached, this belief intensified. The dying person feared not the end of breathing, but the moment of encounter. What had God seen that they had forgotten? What thought had slipped by, unconfessed? What desire had lingered too long? People begged priests to stay, to listen, to absolve, because death without forgiveness meant standing exposed before an all-seeing judge. This fear also made God intimate, not distant, not abstract, but close, too close. People spoke to God constantly, not always in comfort, but in negotiation. Promises were made, bargains formed. If God was watching, perhaps he could be persuaded. Perhaps suffering could be shortened. Perhaps mercy could be earned. In this world, freedom was dangerous. Choice carried weight. Every decision mattered eternally. Nothing could be undone. Time felt heavy, because each moment could tilt the soul toward salvation or damnation. Life became a careful balancing act, performed under a gaze that never turned away. Over generations, this belief became invisible, because it was everywhere. People did not question it. There was no alternative framework. A world without God watching was unimaginable. It would mean suffering without witness, death without meaning, morality without consequence. To medieval people, God watching was not oppression alone. It was structure. It was explanation. It was certainty. In a world that offered very little of it, they lived with fear. Yes, but also with purpose. They endured, believing every struggle was seen, and in that belief, they found the strength to continue living. Under a sky they believed was always looking back at them,